this is an iHeart podcast. Guaranteed human.
From sauce to dust to nuggets, it's Taco Bell's new Diablo Dusted Crispy Chicken Nuggets. Are they mild? If they were mild, they'd have to change the name to Little Rascal Nuggets or Minor Nuisance Nuggets. Definitely Diablo. New Diablo Dusted Crispy Chicken Nuggets. A brand new classic. Only at Taco Bell. At participating U.S. Taco Bell locations for a limited time and while supplies last.
This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, and in this episode 1099 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, thanks for tuning in. We're just about wrapped up with the NFL draft season, but there's one thing I wanted to research before fully turning the page. As you all know, I've got prospect models. I use the various ZAP models to help me project how well a player is going to perform in fantasy football at the NFL level. And as you all know, the college football landscape has changed dramatically over the last 5 or 6 years. We had a pandemic, and that COVID season simply didn't count for players. A player could dismiss it completely as if it didn't happen from an eligibility standpoint. And some players at smaller programs didn't even play. That meant it became more common over this time period for players to stick around for an additional year before declaring for the draft. Meanwhile, name, image, and likeness rules passed, which allowed athletes to get paid. That meant in order to get a whole lot of money, some players didn't have to only try to make it to the NFL. They could do it in college too. There's also transfer rules. They changed during this time frame. Players could more freely move from one school to another without having to sit out, which meant more movement in order to find the right spot to showcase their talent. If a running back was behind a stud on the depth chart, the backup could simply transfer to another school in order to get more playing time. All three of these factors can change the way that we prospect, or I should say, the way that I prospect. But how big of a deal are these changes? Does it actually matter? That's what I'll be digging into on today's show. Before that analysis, though, I did want to send another reminder about the Late Round Prospect Guide. If you want to know more about the ZAP model, if you want to read write-ups about all prospects who went to the NFL Combine, you can do so in the guide. You get those write-ups, you get ZAP scores, rankings, and more. You can learn more about it and purchase the guide over on lateround.com. It'll help with your dynasty leagues, obviously, but I think this class in particular, there's a big redraft element to it as well. But again, lateround.com. So we have the pandemic season, NIL, and transfer rules all shifting this college football landscape. And that could change things from a modeling perspective for sure. For one, we'd imagine players would be older coming out of school. Age is a factor that I'm always looking at in the ZAP model. Older players tend to be worse producers since better players will declare earlier for the draft. But there's another layer to the age equation that goes beyond raw age. If players are sticking around school more, then hypothetically speaking, competition in college might be tougher because the players who are playing college football, they're older and more experienced. If you're a true freshman running back and you're on a team with a fifth-year, 23-year-old running back, there's a 5-year age gap between the two of you. That player may have had experience in multiple systems at multiple schools with a wide variety of competition. That experience could hypothetically be more difficult for that freshman to overcome. Which means it's not just age that's the potential problem. It's age-adjusted production. We might be seeing later breakouts and less true freshman production in this era, which would definitely change the way that the model is viewing players in totality, at least when you compare current classes to the ones that happened 10 years ago. So let's dig into this idea a little bit more. Is age shifting enough to make a dent in how I'm evaluating prospects, or does it not matter? Let's start with running backs. The ZAP model database includes all players who are either drafted or at the NFL Combine since 2011. And I have ZAP models for running back, wide receiver, and tight end. So in all, there are a lot of players and a lot of classes to sift through. With running back, when you look at each class in sum, so the players who were drafted, but also the players who went to the NFL Combine but who weren't drafted, we have been getting older. In 2026, this year's draft class, the average age of a running back was 23.2 years old. The median age was 22.8. Those were the two highest values that we've seen from any class since 2011. Meanwhile, since the 2021 timeframe, we've seen the average running back age among this group jump up by 0.3, so almost half a year. Over the last 3 draft classes, that's more or less the same. So all running backs in the ZAP model database, they're indeed getting older. But what about only drafted running backs? The players who NFL teams actually picked. The guys who are most relevant in fantasy football. Interestingly enough, the median age for running backs in this year's draft class was 22.6. That's certainly on the higher end of ages. But it was higher in 2011, 2021, and 2024. There's actually been next to no correlation between draft class and the average age of drafted running backs from that draft class since 2011. There was much more correlation when looking at the totality of each draft class, which is when you start adding the players who were invited to the combine but then went undrafted. To think about that another way, it seems as though older players, they're getting more love recently because they're getting combine invites. But NFL teams aren't necessarily rewarding those players the way that you would think. Now, we are seeing more 24-year-old running backs get drafted. We had 2 of them this year, 3 of them last year, and 4 the year before that. From 2011 through 2023, we had 7 total. We've had more the last 3 years than the 13 years prior. But we're talking about a very small number of players in general. It's not enough to dramatically skew our average and our median among drafted running backs. And part of the reason for that is we're actually not seeing a dramatic shift in players above the age of 23. We did in 2024, but there were plenty of years from 2011 through like 2018 where we had 5 or 6 23-year-old running backs get drafted. And here's what's probably most important. If you focus solely on top 100 draft selections, we may be seeing slightly older prospects, but it's pretty insignificant. What we're really seeing with running back age is the following. We're getting older running backs invited to the NFL Combine, but they're not always drafted. We do have more of them out there though, so we're bound to see a couple more of them get drafted than usual. With that being said, it's just not enough to be meaningfully different versus our sample. Now, I do think running back is the position that could be impacted by NIL most, at least as it pertains to fantasy football, because as we know, running backs get paid the least amount of money among fantasy relevant positions in the NFL. So if a player can dominate in college and make a comparable salary, maybe even more money, he may be incentivized to stay in college and then not go to the NFL right away. Even still, I don't think that means that the model is all of a sudden wrong or bad or that we're looking at the wrong things. In fact, when you look at age-adjusted production metrics, there's really no sign that things are getting worse. As I said, you could maybe make the argument that with players staying in school longer, it means the team competition on those college teams is then stronger. And when that's the case, it's harder to post good age-adjusted production. But that hasn't really been the case. The model uses prorated best season reception share, best season adjusted yards per team play, and best season adjusted receiving yards per team pass attempt as the main production inputs for running backs. The latter 2 metrics are adjusted for strength of schedule and age in a given season. And again, it's taking the best season within each of those metrics across a player's career. There really hasn't been a super meaningful difference across the board with those metrics. What's really happening is that the better age-adjusted production is simply correlating to the draft classes that were stronger, which is exactly what we want to see happening. Let me give you an example. This year's and 2024's adjusted yards per team play numbers, they were some of the worst that the database has seen. Maybe that has to do with competition being older and being better at the college level. Maybe. But those classes have also not been very good, or at least we know the 2024 class wasn't very good, and we're thinking that the 2026 class isn't very good, just based on draft capital investment. If there was something happening with the competition stuff, we would have seen lower numbers for the 2025 class, for instance. But that one looks well above average according to the model's metrics, according to the production profiles of those players. I think where we're at with this changing college landscape with running backs is that there's some chance that we see like one 24-year-old running back give us something, or maybe one older running back get drafted earlier than usual. But that's still not really the norm. And when we remember an older running back hitting, like a Tyrone Tracy, we forget about the players who didn't hit. Age still seems to get pretty good signal. But at the very least, beyond raw age-adjusted production doesn't seem to be changing in a meaningful way at all. So the production metrics that I've been analyzing, I can still analyze those metrics at running back. This discussion probably has gotten more run though when it comes to wide receivers, if we're being honest. For years now, we've seen discourse in fantasy football circles about early declare status and how much signal that gets. But if wide receivers are incentivized to stay in school longer, whether due to transfer rules, eligibility because of NIL, whatever the case may be, if they're staying in school longer, then we'd likely see fewer early declare wide receivers in general. And that's exactly what we're seeing. The ZAP model database has only seen 7, 6, and 5 early declare wide receivers over the last 3 draft classes. I mean, we've essentially cut the number of early declares in half. More than half. That surely must mean that the average age of wide receivers is getting older then, right? Well, not exactly. When you look at the total ZAP model database, like I just did with running back, that includes players who weren't even drafted. It's hard to believe, but we used to get plenty of early declare wide receivers who went to the NFL Combine, but then weren't drafted. We also got early declare wide receivers who were drafted, but they weren't drafted very high. What's happening today is that early declare wide receivers are simply the best of the best. They're the players who know that they've got a shot at being drafted early. We had 5 of them in this 2026 class, the lowest number that we've seen in the ZAP model's time frame. And guess what? All 5 of them, Carnell Tate, Mekhi Lemon, Casey Concepcion, Zachariah Branch, and Jacoby Lane, were all drafted in the top 100. 100% of them. Last year, we had 6 early declare wide receivers. 4 of them were top 100 picks. The 2 who weren't were Alec Iamaner, who went in round 4, and then Isaiah Bond, who had off-the-field issues and went undrafted. Otherwise, it was Tedero McMillan, top 10 pick, Luther Burden, should have been a first rounder, but was a second rounder, Matthew Golden, and Travis Hunter, both first rounders. Over the last 3 seasons, the last 3 draft classes, 83% of the early declare wide receivers ended up going in the top 100 picks of the NFL draft. That number was basically 30 percentage points lower for all the classes before that time frame. To put that another way, early declares are happening less frequently, yes, but the quality of early declare wide receivers is relatively stagnant. And what's happening is that those early declare receivers are being filled in with other players who stayed 1 year longer in school, more than likely. And the difference of 7 to 9 early declare wide receivers being 1 year older across a larger sample isn't really dramatically changing the average age of a wide receiver class. Now, with that being said, an average or a median age may not change much because the sample size is relatively large. I mean, we have like 50 wide receivers in this year's class alone. When you break things down and look at the number of 23 and 24-year-olds in each class, similar to running back, you are seeing a difference. It's the same kind of math dilemma as we got at running back, where there are more of them, but there aren't enough of them to dramatically change the averages. For example, among wideouts in the ZAP model database, 10% of them from this year's class were over 24 years old. That was 8% last year, 7% the year before that, and 10% in 2023. Before 2023, the typical class saw about 3% of the wide receivers over 24 years of age. And the same thing is happening with players over 23. 38% of them from this year's class were over 23, 34% from last year's, 37% the year prior. But from 2011 through 2022, we had just one season where at least 30% of the class was made up of wide receivers who were 23 years or older. Over the last 3 years, the lowest mark is 34%. The thing is, most of those players, they're not getting drafted early. We had one player above 23 years old get drafted in the top 100 this year, and that was among 17 wide receivers, the most that we've seen in the top 100 since at least 2011. That one player was Dazon Stribling. We had one 23-year-old last year, almost 2, depending on how you want to round up or down. We more or less have seen the same number of 23-year-old top 100 wide receivers dating all the way back to 2011. That hasn't changed that much at all. What has changed is how old the day 3 guys are. But day 3, as we know, produces very, very few fantasy relevant wide receivers. So yes, early declare statuses, they're changing, and we're seeing more 23 and 24-year-old wide receivers in the draft pool these days. But that's mostly changing the day 3 and the undrafted players, not day 1 and day 2. And day 1 and day 2, that's what we're focused on most in fantasy football. That's where the majority of our analysis is drawn to. They're the most important players in this game. Now, the other question is about production. If the competition in college includes players who aren't leaving early for school, meaning they're more experienced, and if players are seemingly older, does that mean their age-adjusted production is suffering? As in, are players having a harder time producing earlier on in their collegiate careers because the competition on their team is just a lot more difficult to overcome? Well, I've got breakout score as the perfect metric to help us out with that. Breakout score is my way of looking at age and schedule-adjusted receiving yards per team pass attempt. It scores a player's breakout within that metric on a scale from 0 to 100. And it's the single most important production metric that goes into the ZAP model at wide receiver. When you look at breakout scores among day 1 and day 2 picks over the last 3 years, you'll find that the scores are essentially lower in total. For example, the average breakout score for round 1 wide receivers from 2011 to 2023 is 70.7. Over the last 3 years, it's been 62. When it comes to day 2 picks from 2011 to 2023, the average breakout score was 51.4. Over the last 3 years, we're looking at 39.4. Those are kind of meaningful shifts. And when I saw them, I said, man, maybe there is something to this. Maybe there's more difficult competition and it's holding back some of these wide receivers. And teams are recognizing that. And despite the worst age-adjusted production profiles, teams are still giving these guys decent draft capital, even if their production doesn't always match, because teams are sort of making excuses for the players, if you will. And then I thought about it more deeply, and I realized, wait a second, some of these draft classes really haven't been that good. The first-round wide receivers in 2024 were Marvin Harrison Jr., Malik Neighbors, Rome Odunze, Brian Thomas, Xavier Worthy, Xavier Legette, and Ricky Pearsall. Those last 2 players had breakout scores below 40. That dragged down that first-round number. And then the day 2 wide receivers that year, my goodness, they were bad. Thankfully, we had Ladd McConkey. That's a big hit. But then it's Keon Coleman, Adonai Mitchell, Jalen Polk, Jermaine Burton, Malachi Corley, Roman Wilson, Jalen McMillan, and Luke McCaffrey. So yeah, the breakout scores were lower for that class compared to 2011 through 2023. But I think it's really warranted. I think the model was kind of doing its job. Last year, Luther Burden had an elite breakout score. He's the only day 2 wide receiver that we currently feel really, really good about. Otherwise, it's Trey Harris, Savion Williams, Jaden Higgins, Jack Besh, Jalen Knoll, Pat Bryant, Isaac Tesla, and Kyle Williams. First rounders last year were Tedero McMillan, good breakout score, Emeka Ibuka, good breakout score, and then Matthew Golden and Travis Hunter, who didn't have good breakout scores. And guys, this is not hindsight analysis. This is all in the late round prospect guides that I've been publishing over the last few years. So yes, breakout scores, they have been lower recently. But I don't think it necessarily has to do with college football rules. I think it just has to do with the fact that teams are drafting wide receivers higher than they probably should, given those wide receivers' age-adjusted production profiles. And this is pretty much what I've been saying all offseason about this 2026 class. Someone is going to emerge from day 2 more than likely, because we had so many day 2 wide receiver picks. But there's just average profile after average profile after average profile in that range. Their breakout scores are lower. And I don't think the breakout scores are lower because they're playing against super seniors. I think they're lower because they're just not as good of prospects as their draft capital suggests. Now, I ran through this exact same exercise at tight end. I looked at the average age of each class since 2011, and I looked at how breakout scores have been impacted, if at all. Similar to the other positions across the entirety of the sample, we do see a slight uptick in average age in recent tight end classes. But I'm talking like less than 3 months on average. But once again, when it comes to the higher end draft capital, we see no difference from an age perspective. In fact, over the last 3 years, over the last 3 draft classes, top 100 tight ends have been younger compared to the 13 classes prior. When it comes to breakout scores, we're seeing a very similar pattern as what we saw with wide receiver. Technically, over the last few years, breakout scores at tight end, they have been lower among top 100 players. But they've also followed draft class talent. The 2025 class, for example, one that might go down as historically good for fantasy football purposes. The top 100 tight ends in that class have pretty normal breakout scores. Colston Loveland and Harold Fannin have elite breakout scores, just as an example. What's really dragging down the average over the last few years is the 2024 class and then this year's class. And I don't think that's all that surprising. I don't think that also signals that NIL or transfer rules are majorly impacting age-adjusted production at tight end. In 2024, the top 100 tight end selections were Brock Bowers, Ben Sinnott, and Tip Ryman. Bowers had a breakout score of 100, quite literally could not have been better. Sinnott's was okay enough, but Ryman's was legitimately bad. So he's doing a lot of the work in lowering the average in 2024. This year, we had a lot of day 2 tight ends, and we had a lot of average profiles from those day 2 tight ends. Not all of them were bad, but it's a lot like this year's wide receiver class, where we have a lot of players to choose from, but not a lot of elite talent to choose from in that day 2 range. We're seeing pretty consistent data across all 3 positions. Yes, we're getting a few more 23 and 24-year-olds added to each class. That's having a slight impact on the overall age at each class. But it's not super meaningful because our samples aren't like 8 players deep. And not only that, the most important thing here, the age of the relevant pieces in fantasy football, the day 1, the day 2 picks, those ages really haven't changed that much. Teams are generally still opting for the younger players with higher end draft capital. And to me, there hasn't really been an impact on age-adjusted production, which is hugely important for the ZAP model. Age isn't always a direct input in those models. It's a driver. It's what can change a player's production score because I'm adjusting that production for the age of a player when that production occurs. And even though players may be staying in school longer, it's not having any sort of real, genuine impact on age-adjusted production. Probably because if a player's good enough to eventually dominate in the NFL, he'll still be good enough early on in his collegiate career to dominate the touches in his college offense, even if he's playing alongside players who are 4 or 5 years older. So my conclusion here is that this changing college landscape is technically changing the player pool for each draft class. Though I think that's going to be reverted back a little bit here shortly, given the COVID eligibility stuff. But NIL transfer rules, they've definitely made some impact on the makeup of each draft class. But when we're focusing on the players who matter most in fantasy football, the high-end talent, the day 1, the day 2 picks, I really don't think this stuff matters that much. And if your league mates think that it does, if they start making excuses for poor production profiles, or they're okay with consistently over and over again drafting older prospects, I'd say that's where you can take advantage. Because those profiles are still very, very volatile, even within this new college football environment. That's it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you yet subscribe to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter and on Blue Sky at Late Round QB. Thanks for listening, everyone. As usual, I'll be live on Wednesday for the Late Round Fantasy Football Show, noon Eastern on the YouTube channel. And then on Friday, you'll hear another mailbag episode. I'll talk to you guys then.
"250 years ago, America made a promise of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Since 1903, Harley-Davidson has been living it, out on the open road, at the next exit ramp, with old friends, new ones, and the next generation of riders. Because the best part of any promise is keeping it. Harley-Davidson Motorcycles. Ride."
You know how it's never really about where you're going? It's about who you're going with. The right people can turn any drive into a great memory. That's something Toyota really believes. They design vehicles around real life and real people, the ones who make plans happen and bring everyone together. Inside, everything's built with passengers in mind. Comfortable seating, smart layouts, and space that actually works so everyone can relax and enjoy the ride. There's room for the people, room for the stuff, and room for the moments that happen along the way. Because when people are the destination, your ride is important. Learn more at Toyota.com and find the vehicle that fits your people.
This is an iHeart podcast. Guaranteed Human.